the Benin Empire, a king's riches and the secrets they erased. The ashes of a golden city. In February 1897, a column of British troops marches through the smoking ruins of one of Africa's greatest cities, Benin. Behind them, flames consume centuries of history. Ahead of them, crates filled with treasures, bronzes, ivories, carved tusks, and golden artifacts are loaded for transport to London. The official reports would call it a punitive expedition, a civilized response to a barbaric king. But when you look closely at what was taken, at the sheer sophistication of what they burned and looted, you have to ask, what kind of civilization did they destroy to feel justified in calling it primitive? For decades, the story of the Benin Empire was buried under European propaganda, reduced to a single image: savages punished by civilization. But behind the smoke and the silence lies another truth: a golden empire, ruled by an Oba whose power stretched across centuries, whose people built one of the most advanced cities in the world. And today, we uncover the empire they tried to erase. Before it fell, Benin City was the heart of a thriving civilization. European visitors in the 15th and 16th centuries described broad, clean streets, straight and orderly, unlike anything they had seen in Europe at the time. Houses were made of red earth that gleamed like copper under the sun. Walls and moats, stretching for thousands of miles, protected a capital that was alive with trade, art, and ritual. At the center stood the Oba's palace, a complex so vast it seemed like a city within a city. Columns of carved ivory depicted stories of gods, kings, and warriors. Metalworkers cast bronze plaques that chronicled history, a visual archive long before photography existed. To the Benin people, this was not just a capital, it was the center of the world. Every path, every trade route, every ritual began and ended at the Oba's throne. The Oba wasn't merely a king, he was the living link between the people and their ancestors, the guardian of balance and order. But the story of how this divine kingship began, that's where myth meets power. Long before the Obas, Benin was ruled by a line of ancient kings known as the Ogisos, the rulers of the sky. They governed a loose confederation of clans, powerful yet divided. Over time, corruption, conflict, and chaos tore the system apart. The kingdom fell into disunity. In the heart of this turmoil, the elders of Benin sought help from the spiritual cradle of the Yoruba world, Ile-Ife. From there came a prince named Oranmiyan, son of the legendary Oduduwa. He arrived not as a conqueror, but as a reformer, a man destined to reshape Benin's destiny. But Oranmiyan's rule was brief. The people of Benin, proud and fiercely independent, resisted his foreign ways. He returned to Ife, leaving behind a child, Iweka, who would become the first true Oba of Benin. It was this moment, the birth of the Oba dynasty, that transformed Benin from a fractured realm into a centralized empire. Iweka's rule redefined kingship. The Oba was no longer merely human, he was sacred, eternal, the embodiment of the kingdom itself. Through ritual, art, and ceremony, the Oba became the axis of Benin's world. Every victory, every festival, every bronze cast in his name reinforced this divine power. But the transformation was not without cost. The Oba's authority had to be absolute, and that absolute power demanded order, discipline, and sometimes blood. Generations later, the kingdom reached its golden age under Oba Iware the Great in the 15th century. A visionary, a warrior, and a reformer, Iware reshaped Benin into an imperial powerhouse. He reorganized the city, built vast moats, and expanded the palace. He introduced strict court systems, festivals, and guilds, laying the foundation for one of Africa's most enduring political systems. Under Iware, Benin's influence spread like wildfire across modern-day Nigeria, parts of Ghana, and the Niger Delta. His empire thrived on trade, ivory, pepper, cloth, and coral. In exchange came salt, iron, and later European goods. But what truly set Benin apart was not its economy, but its artistry. The bronze casters of Igun Street, a hereditary guild, mastered the lost wax casting technique, a process so intricate that European experts centuries later would marvel at its precision. Each plaque told a story: obas in procession, warriors in regalia, leopards symbols of royal strength, and foreign merchants offering tribute. The city's walls, stretching over 16,000 kilometers when combined, were more than just defenses. They were monuments of unity, every citizen contributing to the building of their shared destiny. Archaeologists would later call them the world's largest earthworks carried out prior to the mechanical era, surpassing even the Great Wall of China in sheer volume. And yet, this mighty empire stood on the edge of something it did not yet understand: the arrival of strangers from across the sea. When the first Portuguese explorers reached Benin in the late 1400s, they did not find the primitive tribe they expected. Instead, they found diplomats, protocol, and organization that mirrored European courts. Trade began cautiously at first. Coral beads, guns, and luxury goods flowed into Benin. Ivory, pepper, and later enslaved people flowed out. But beneath the polite exchanges lay tension, the kind that always grows when two worlds meet, each convinced of its own superiority. The Europeans wrote glowing reports back home, describing Benin as the most orderly city in Africa. But in their letters, a subtle tone lingered: admiration mixed with envy. Because here was a black kingdom that was not only equal to them in some ways, it was greater. The Portuguese chroniclers could not easily admit that. And so, they began to rewrite their impressions, shifting from respect to curiosity, and from curiosity to fear. Soon, the word civilized became a weapon, a label Europe would use to justify conquest. For now, though, Benin stood untouchable, its bronze still glowing, its walls still strong, its Oba still divine. But history was already turning. The gold that once fueled trade was now breeding greed. The alliances that once ensured peace were cracking under the weight of ambition. And in the distance, the thunder of empire was beginning to roll. The fire that would one day consume Benin had already been lit quietly, invisibly, in the hands of those who called themselves explorers. They called them bronzes, but to the people of Benin they were not ornaments, they were voices. Each casting, each figure, each plaque whispered the memory of a king, the story of a battle, the breath of a god. In the heart of Benin City stood the Igun Eronwan, the Guild of Royal Bronze Casters. Their art was a sacred inheritance, passed down through generations, guarded with the intensity of divine duty. The bronze casters did not merely shape metal, they forged eternity. Through the mystical lost wax technique, molten brass flowed like lifeblood into clay molds shaped with precision and prayer. When the mold broke, what emerged was not just a sculpture, it was a resurrection. Each plaque captured moments of the kingdom's triumph: the Oba seated upon his throne, the soldiers in regalia, the ceremonies of harvest and worship. They were, in essence, Benin's libraries, a visual history of power and spirit, immortalized in metal. European visitors stood in awe. When they first saw the bronzes, they could not believe Africans had made them. Some claimed they must have come from Atlantis or ancient Greece. But no, this was indigenous genius, born from centuries of perfection, guarded within a civilization that saw art as divine communion. These casters worked in near silence, their craft wrapped in ritual. Before melting the metal, they prayed. Before touching the molds, they purified their hands. For to mishandle the bronze was not a mistake, it was an offense to the gods. And so, the bronzes gleamed not just with gold and copper, but with reverence. They were proof that Benin had already mastered what Europe was still trying to understand: the union of science, art, and spirit. But to understand Benin's greatness, you must enter its spiritual map, a cosmos where the Oba was not just a ruler, but a bridge between worlds. In Benin belief, the universe was divided into the world of the living, the world of the ancestors, and the realm of the gods. The Oba stood at the intersection of these realms, chosen by the gods, sustained by the ancestors, and ruling the living. The bronzes served as anchors between these worlds. Each piece held spiritual energy, says, the divine force of creation. When the Oba's likeness was cast, it wasn't art, it was incarnation. His spirit lived within the metal, ensuring his presence never faded, even after death. The people believed their land was protected by Edo, the earth goddess, the divine mother whose name became the name of their city. Festivals honored her, rituals fed her, and the Oba ruled by her favor. The kingdom's wealth, its gold, ivory, and bronze, were not mere resources, they were manifestations of cosmic balance. To prosper, the people had to remain in harmony with Edo and the ancestors. Every ceremony, every sacrifice, every wall built around the city was more than defense, it was spiritual engineering. A civilization guided not by coincidence, but by divine order. So when Europeans arrived, they didn't meet tribes. They met a civilization that had mapped the unseen, a society where kings ruled through ritual, art spoke like scripture, and the gods watched from bronze eyes. Then came the strangers from across the sea, the Portuguese. It was the 15th century. The ships arrived not with armies, but with wonder. And at first, the meeting was one of equals. The Portuguese saw a city unlike any they'd imagined. Broad streets, grand palaces, moats and markets, and walls stretching farther than any in Europe. They called it the Great City of Benin. Trade began. Copper and brass flowed into Benin. Pepper, ivory, and fine cloth flowed out. The Oba controlled it all with discipline and calculation. The Portuguese sought gold, but they found governance. They sought slaves, but Benin allowed few to leave its borders. Benin's laws were strict. Human life was sacred, trade was regulated, and foreign influence was contained. Unlike many coastal kingdoms, Benin dictated the terms. They established embassies, exchanged gifts, and even shared technologies. The Oba sent ambassadors to Lisbon. Paintings in Europe depicted the Benin envoys as noblemen, dressed with pride and authority. At that time, Benin was a global player, its influence stretching beyond the Niger Delta into international politics and commerce. It was not a kingdom discovered by Europe. It was a kingdom that Europe had the privilege to meet. And for a time, the balance held. But history teaches that greed never sleeps. As the centuries turned, trade grew darker. The demand for slaves in Europe and the Americas began to poison the Atlantic economy. Benin resisted at first. The Obas restricted large-scale slave trading, refusing to turn human lives into coin. But tension rose as neighboring powers and European companies bypassed Benin's authority, creating chaos along the coast. The moral line was blurring. Wars with the Itsekiri over control of trade routes weakened Benin's grip. Factions within the court began to argue. Should the kingdom adapt to survive, or resist and risk decline. It was here that the first cracks appeared, not from invasion, but from moral corrosion. The sacred order that once held the kingdom together began to tremble. The bronzes, once symbols of divine power, now reflected anxiety battles, defenses, omens. And in the distance, ships grew larger, flags multiplied, and the scent of empire hung in the air. They came not for trade, but for conquest. The same land that had dazzled them now tempted them. The same bronzes they admired, they would one day steal. Benin, the golden city, stood at the edge of destiny. And the storm was coming. Every empire meets its reckoning, not always from the outside, but often from within. By the 18th century, the great walls of Benin, once symbols of strength and unity, began to echo with unease. The trade that had brought prosperity was changing, poisoned by greed and foreign interference. When Britain abolished the slave trade in the early 1800s, it was not out of kindness alone. It was strategy. The British Navy patrolled the coast, not just to end slavery but to reshape Africa's economy under their control. For Benin, this was catastrophic. Slave trading had never been its foundation, but it had become part of its economic structure. The sudden collapse of coastal trade routes left the kingdom isolated, its merchants bankrupt, its wealth thinning. Internal strife deepened. Rival chiefs competed for influence. The once revered court rituals became arenas for political manipulation. Some blamed the Oba's council. Others whispered that the gods had turned away. The mighty city's heartbeat slowed. The world around it was changing. Steamships, rifles, global empires, and Benin was being cornered. The great walls still stood, but their strength could no longer keep out the winds of imperial ambition. This was not yet the end, but the cracks had formed, and in those cracks, the shadows of betrayal began to grow. Then came Oba of Benin, the last great king of Benin. He ascended the throne in 1888, inheriting not only a kingdom, but a crisis. A proud man, deeply spiritual and cautious of the outside world, Oba understood the danger that lurked beyond his borders. Across the Niger Delta, the British were expanding no longer as traders, but as conquerors. Under the banner of civilization and free trade, the Royal Niger Company sought to dominate the region's palm oil and resources. But Benin was in the way. When British officials demanded open trade routes, Oba refused. The Oba did not trust them, and history proved him right. The British branded him hostile. They claimed he was obstructing progress, but what they truly wanted was access to Benin's land, its people, and its treasures. In January 1897, James Phillips, a British consul, wrote a letter to his superiors. He proposed what he called a diplomatic mission to Benin City, a seemingly peaceful visit. But the truth was far from peaceful. Hidden within the letter was another intent. "I intend to depose the King of Benin," Phillips wrote, "and establish an administration in his place." Without approval, he marched toward Benin with a group of officers, traders, and soldiers armed and arrogant. When word reached Oba, he was horrified. He had warned the British not to approach during a sacred festival, a period when war and diplomacy were forbidden, but they ignored the warning. Benin's generals saw the act as provocation. They decided to act before the British could strike. In the dense forest near Ugbin, the ambush came. The Phillips expedition was wiped out. And in London, outrage followed. The newspapers screamed of a massacre, but no one spoke of the deceit that caused it. No one mentioned that it was the British who had trespassed first. The empire demanded vengeance. and what followed would be called with cold irony the punitive expedition. February 1897. The British sent 1,200 soldiers, armed with Maxim guns and artillery, against a city that had never attacked Britain, only defended itself. They called it punishment, but it was conquest. From the coast, the columns advanced. Villages were burned, shrines were desecrated, those who resisted were cut down. The British moved like a storm through the Edo heartland, leaving ashes in their wake. When they reached Benin City, what they found was not savagery, but splendor. Bronze heads, ivory tusks, coral-beaded thrones, treasures of 1,000 years. And in that splendor, they saw profit. The soldiers looted everything. Palaces were stripped, sacred altars desecrated, ancestral heads taken as souvenirs. One officer wrote, "We found the city full of works of art. The whole place was like a vast museum." Another admitted, "We burnt the city." Flames consumed the royal palace, the heart of Benin's spiritual world. The air filled with the crackle of fire and the cries of a civilization being erased. Oba of Benin fled into the forest, seeking refuge among loyal chiefs. But betrayal awaited even there. He was later captured, betrayed by those who sought favor from the invaders. When the British brought him to Lagos, he was not executed. Instead, they humiliated him, stripped of his crown, his coral regalia, his dignity. They photographed him in exile, as if to say, "This is what happens to kings who resist empire." They called it victory. But in truth, it was vandalism on a cosmic scale. Over 4,000 artifacts were taken: bronzes, ivories, royal altars, the spiritual DNA of Benin. They were sold in auctions across London, Berlin, and Paris. Some ended up in the British Museum, others in Berlin's Ethnological Museum, the Louvre, and private collections. The world marveled at their beauty, yet ignored the blood behind the shine. And as the last fires died in Benin, the people wept. The Oba was gone. The gods were silent. The city of light had been turned to smoke. For the British, it was a successful expedition. For Benin, it was the day the world ended. The smoke of 1897 still hung heavy when British soldiers, having torched Benin City, began to dig through the ashes. They did not search for survivors. They searched for treasure. Bronze plaques, carved ivory tusks, coral-beaded crowns, all that once adorned the royal palace of the Oba, were piled into crates and shipped off across the ocean. London, Berlin, Paris. The markets of Europe became the new courtyards of Benin's stolen glory. Inside the cold halls of the British Museum, the plaques were polished and numbered. But their meaning was erased. To the curators, they were merely artifacts of African art. But to Benin they were divine records, bronze scriptures of ancestry and faith. Each plaque was a page in the kingdom's living Bible, engraved with the faces of kings, the victories of warriors, and the blessings of the gods. They were not just art. They were titles of ownership, deeds of sovereignty, and testimonies of divine mandate, all stolen in one generation and displayed as trophies in another. And yet, in the stillness of those museum halls, the bronzes seemed to whisper, "We were never yours." For over a century, the West built arguments to keep them. They're safer here. They belong to humanity. They were acquired legally at the time. But behind those excuses lies something darker, a refusal to confront the truth that museums were built on conquest, and that every display case holding the Benin Bronzes is a glass coffin holding someone's stolen story. As visitors stroll beneath spotlights, few realize that the light shining on those bronzes was once firelight, the glow of burning temples, the reflection of loss. And though the plaques sit still behind glass, their message continues to move across generations. You can erase our name, but not our voice. More than a century passed before the world began to truly listen. In Benin City, a new Oba ascended, Oba Iware II, a descendant of the very kings whose faces are cast in bronze. With quiet dignity, he raised his voice not for revenge, but for restoration. His call was simple: let what belongs to Benin return to Benin. Nigeria's government joined the movement. Universities, activists, and historians rallied behind the cause. For decades, their words fell on deaf ears until cracks began to form in the walls of denial. Germany became one of the first nations to act. In 2022, it announced the return of over 1,000 Benin Bronzes to Nigeria, a symbolic yet seismic act of justice. Soon, museums in the United States and the United Kingdom followed with partial returns, each plaque coming home like a lost child after a century of exile. But not everyone agreed. Some institutions still cling tightly, afraid to lose what they call their universal collections. They claim that these pieces belong to the world, not to a people. But that's like saying a stolen crown belongs to everyone who admires it, except the king whose head it was made for. The struggle continues not just to reclaim bronze and ivory, but to reclaim memory. Because what was taken was not only beauty, but identity. When a people's past is stolen, their confidence in the present begins to fade. And so, the battle today is not just legal, it is spiritual. It is about returning truth to its rightful place. The bronzes were not meant to rest behind glass. They were meant to tell stories, to bless generations, to remind a nation of who they are. As one Nigerian historian said, "When a people lose their art, they lose their mirror. Returning it is how they learn to see themselves again." So, what does this story mean for us today? The Benin Empire stands as both a warning and a witness. It reminds us that unchecked ambition, even when it begins in prosperity, can open the door to destruction. Benin's thirst for trade, once its greatest strength, became its undoing when morality gave way to profit. The empire that once sold ivory later sold people, and the people who once traded gold became slaves to foreign greed. But the story doesn't end in tragedy alone. It also reveals the spiritual cost of theft, not just to those who lost, but to those who took. Because when a civilization steals another's soul to decorate its walls, it becomes haunted by the very silence it created. Every empire that conquers eventually faces the same question: what do we lose when we take what is not ours? And every generation must choose whether to repeat that mistake, whether through greed, injustice, or indifference. But this story also carries hope. It tells us that history is not a graveyard, it is a seed. When truth is unearthed, justice begins to grow again. When memory is restored, nations begin to heal. The Benin Bronzes are more than metal. They are mirrors of conscience, reflecting both the darkness of greed and the light of resilience. Their survival is proof that you can burn a city, but you cannot burn a legacy. And so, as we stand at the end of this story, one truth remains. The Benin Empire did not end, it was silenced. But the silence is over. From museum halls to classrooms, from scholars to storytellers, from elders to children, the Bronzes are speaking again. They speak of kings who ruled with wisdom, of artisans who forged history with their hands, and of a people whose greatness was never lost, only hidden. Today, the question is not whether the bronzes will return. The question is whether we will listen when they do. Because every return is more than restitution, it is resurrection. It is history coming home. It is truth standing up again after 100 years of silence. So, if you've walked this journey with us through the rise, the glory, the betrayal, and the ashes, let this be your moment to act. Don't just watch history. Reclaim it. Share it. Tell it again until the world remembers what was erased. This is Beyond the History Books, where forgotten empires rise again, not in conquest, but in truth. Because the story of Benin is not about the past. It's about the power of remembering. The fire that once destroyed a kingdom is now the light that reveals its glory.